Um, our session for the next 45, 50 minutes or so is on beginning farmers and ranchers. And our two presenters are Margiana Peterson-Rockne and Adriel Sue Flanders. Margiana has a long list of accomplishments in her bio. I'll name only a few of them. She grew up on a dairy goat farm in Massachusetts. She studied geology and bio at Brown, but at the same time started a 5-acre diversified vegetable and livestock farm. At the same time, she founded a network of young farmers called the Young Farmer Network. She worked at the New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, the Boston Farming Institute, training new farmers. She ran the two previous versions of this conference when she worked at Harvard and is now a doctoral student at UC Berkeley, studying policy and management issues at the intersection of climate change, ag practices, and beginning limited resource farmer livelihoods. Adriel Sue Flanders has been the harvest manager for the past 3 years at Sienna Farms here in Massachusetts, where he worked with other young beginning farmers and helped develop an apprentice farmer training curriculum. He's now working on a new farm-to-table project in North Adams, Massachusetts, and he studied the anthropology of food and gender at Reed College.
All right, welcome everyone. And if you want to move down from the back, that would be great. Our plan for today is to spend like 15 to 20 minutes talking, and then we're going to do a workshop activity, and then Q&A. So we hope that everyone will get involved. And this will be more of a discussion, so not just us talking. To start off, hear us? Is this working? Yeah, that's working. Okay, yeah. Thanks for bringing that up. And also, feel free to interrupt us with questions. But we're going to try to go through this somewhat quickly so that we can do these more interactive pieces. Okay, so Massachusetts, most farms, as Adriel said, we're sort of like being reductionist here, but most farms in Massachusetts are relatively small scale compared to the national average, have relatively few agricultural workers, and the types of agricultural workers that they do have are a little bit different. So we're going to talk about that as we go along. Because many of the farms in Massachusetts are on that small scale and hiring few enough workers that they're exempt from most federal labor standards, we see some sort of special sort of gray areas of the law that we'll talk about in a little bit. But one thing that I wanted to point out here is that it's very hard to figure out what rules apply to you if you're a farmer. And so a lot of farmers who I've worked with are fearful of litigation and getting in trouble, even for things that they're not on the hook for. For example, a farmer who I've worked with named Joe, he's been a worker on a dairy farm, a small-scale dairy farm, for many, many years. And he recently has had some health issues, some of them related to injuries that he's had on that job. And he was just told that he can't come back to work because his employer is worried that the doctor will turn in the farm employer, the farmer, for not providing workers' compensation for Joe, now that he's suffering from some health issues. So there are things like this where farmers are very worried and fearful about the implications of their labor practices. We can go on to the next one. Okay, California obviously has a very different system of agriculture, generally a lot larger scale, where about 70% of our fruits and vegetables and nuts are grown. Also a lot of rangeland. About 60% of California is in rangeland, so there are a lot of cattle produced and sheep. One sort of special factor about California is that the National Labor Relations Act in 1935 made it so that at a federal level, farm worker organizers are not protected. However, in California, farm workers do unionize, which is pretty unique. And the United Farm Workers Union, or the United Farm Workers, is probably the largest of those. And therefore, they've been able to make some successful demands, including recently, just this year, just in January, there was an overtime law passed. So now farm workers who work over 40 hours a week, even if they're farm workers just in the field, harvesting, for example, are legally supposed to be paid overtime. What this means on the ground, like we already mentioned, many of those folks are worried about coming forward because of their immigration status, and so often don't. And it also means that farmers are increasingly turning to technology to supply that labor so that they can not pay as much to their labor force. So that's a conversation that's happening right now in California. And many of the things, we're just going to kind of throw out ideas, and then what you're interested in, we can talk about more after. Okay, so that's a little bit of setting the stage about agricultural labor, and now to set the stage about beginning farmers. So beginning farmers in the U.S. Are now about 25%. Beginning farmers, according to the USDA, are those who have been farming 10 years or less. This is a map of where they are, so you can see there's some geographic distribution. Yeah.
Sorry, just because we talked about definitions, you're talking about who own farms.
So, yeah, that's a great question. So beginning farmers on the USDA census, this here is anyone who identifies as a farmer. So not necessarily those who own farms. And actually, it's a trend that beginning farmers don't own their farms and are operating on leased land, which is definitely affecting the types of agriculture that beginning farmers especially are investing in. So beginning farmers especially, are turning to types of agriculture that require, for example, lower inputs. We see a lot of beginning farmers going into ranching, where you would historically not necessarily own your land anyway, but lease certain pastures to ranch on at certain times. So a growing proportion of beginning farmers are going into fields like ranching. But that's a great question. A few other notes about beginning farmers. They also tend to be diversifying their operations. So not necessarily just planting one type of crop or raising one type of livestock, but having a diverse array of farm enterprises. They also tend to be accessing information through informal and peer-to-peer networks, not necessarily through the more traditional forms of knowledge acquisition for farmers, like cooperative extension or going to school for agriculture. And many are first-generation farmers or not from farming families. So let's move on to the next slide to talk a little bit about who some of these beginning farmers are. So these are some typologies that correlate to some of the folks who we've worked with, some of the beginning farmers that we've worked with. This doesn't include everyone, but it is a helpful way to organize some of the types of beginning farmers who are doing certain types of farming activities and also tend to have certain types of labor practices. So we'll be kind of referring back to some of these.
And I think something that is important to think about when we start to think about beginning farmer typologies are some of the boundaries that beginning farmers, as well as policy, see between farmers who are invested in, might characterize it as kind of agroecological, maybe permaculture, organic, small farming, and then individuals who are engaged in a larger style of agriculture. And I think policy is often made by people, representatives of big ag, as we call it. And thus, I think we end up in gray areas. And maybe we can talk a little bit about that right now, where some of these farmers are constantly interacting in different ways with the law, and the law doesn't always apply. The policies don't always apply in a clear way. It's often really hard to understand what those labor policies are, and often they're aimed at farms that really have nothing to do with what people are doing. In my experience at Sienna Farms, we hired 10 to 15 apprentices every year, and I think the apprenticeship and internship model is a common one for a lot of smaller organic farms. Maybe some people here have done labor as apprentices or interns. And they range really from unpaid experiences for a season all the way to paid with housing, with overtime. And I think that that's a way that farmers, particularly that can tap into that sort of labor market, are able to get really cheap labor. It's often untrained. Often it comes without health insurance, something that I worked with Sienna Farms for a while on, is trying to figure out a way to get health insurance coverage for some of the year-round employees. But it was very difficult figuring out what the seasonal laws were, which if apprentices were able to be categorized legally as seasonal employees, which because they worked for longer than 3 months, they were not. And then just the kind of continuation of coverage that farms would have to continue to pay people on plans like COBRA, which really don't meld with farming income. I think housing is another question. At Sienna Farms, we were farming 75 acres of diversified vegetables and staffing it almost completely with untrained apprentice labor, people who had never farmed before. I think most farms around here at that scale are thinking about or engaging with an H-2A visa program and some migrant seasonal workers. Because we couldn't offer housing at Sienna Farms, which is a stipulation of that visa, we couldn't think about that as an option. And I think that's where questions about technology and efficiency come into play. Also, I think questions about health and safety are another gray area. We heard about it a little bit in the previous session, if you were here. But even on organic farms, there are really dangerous pesticides and things that people work with, often without proper training or without proper protection. And I think that some farms obviously follow the law very carefully and the regulations about those pesticides, but other people, not just with spraying them, but with going out in the fields and picking, with doing field work around after crops have been sprayed, aren't necessarily following those directly, or they're very hard to follow, hard to understand. And then lastly, I think working in a gray area, the question of undocumented workers. I mean, as we know, over 50% of all farm workers in the country are undocumented. And I think that, again, is getting at who we think about when we think about beginning farmers. and who we think about when we're thinking about resources and support networks for beginning farmers. So I think that, yeah, do you want to talk about the barriers?
Yeah, so we'll just go over a few more things, and we might skip a few things we were going to talk about just so we have time for the workshop. But these are some barriers to farming, especially for beginning farmers and ranchers. And of course, today we're talking about labor, but I wanted to highlight, yeah, go ahead.
I just had a quick question about the last slide, where it says farm workers and farm operator. Would that include the apprentice and interns then that may then become a farm operator, or?
That's a great question. This generally doesn't. So this is something we see more out in California, where there are some programs, especially there's some incubator programs like ALBA is one, that specifically work with farm worker populations who are primarily Latino and Latina, and help transition them to being farm operators where they actually have their own farm businesses. So generally apprentices, and again, these are all like generalizations, but just like ways to categorize how we think about these. Often farm, as Adriel mentioned, who both on the farmer side and the apprentice side, who has access to those networks to be tapped into kind of farm apprenticeship or like woofing type opportunities, tends to be more of the young, well-educated farmers than we tend to see in some of these others. Second career farmers also often we see offering apprenticeships and farm, woofing and things like that. But certainly the farm worker to farm operator up here is really talking about that particular case of farm workers. Okay, we can go through the next one. Okay, so yeah, I just want to point out three really big barriers, especially for beginning farmers, around hiring farm labor above the law, sort of in the green area of the law. So one is access to labor, and especially labor that might need to have a lot of different skills. For example, in Massachusetts, on these smaller scale farms, often they're not hiring that many people, and so if someone is going to hire labor, that person might need to do many different types of tasks, including possibly managing a farmer's market and harvesting and planning and doing sort of all different types, truck driving, et cetera. So it can be hard to find people who are able and willing to do all of those different types of labor. And then also, as we mentioned, as soon as someone is doing many different types of labor or anything outside of the field, there are more strict regulations that apply that are harder for smaller scale or beginning farmers to comply with. Another is access to money to pay labor. So especially if you're a beginning farmer, it's a startup business like any other startup business and very financially intensive. And often beginning farmers are in debt and have taken out loans to lease or buy their land and set up infrastructure, et cetera. And then a third that comes up a lot is the burden of record keeping. So as I mentioned, we do have the regulation that any farm labor, there's supposed to be records kept about that. And those records can be burdensome, especially for beginning or limited resource farmers. Okay, so opportunities. I just wanted to reiterate here, I mentioned this earlier, but increasingly beginning farmers are especially intensifying their operations and diversifying their operations and selling their services. So this is a picture of a farmer who I've worked with in Montana who has a grazing business. So they actually make a lot more money by selling the service of grazing their goats than by selling the goats themselves. So again, when they're looking for labor, and they do have hired labor, they're looking for people who have a certain set of skills around, in this case, ranching and interacting with customers who are hiring that service, not buying the animals. Okay, we're gonna, gray areas. We already talked a bit about this, but another one that I wanted to mention is family labor. So this is certainly the case on family farms, if we think back to the, sort of those beginning farmer typologies on family farms, but also a farming community that I've worked with quite a bit are immigrant and refugee farmers in peri-urban spaces in Massachusetts and out in California, and often these folks are relying on their communities and extended family networks for labor, and very often those people are not paid or not records aren't kept, etc. So it gets into this tricky area. An immediate family are exempt from needing to be paid or needing to have records kept, but non-immediate family, so for example, second cousins or something like that, you would technically need to be paying those people if you're a farmer. Smaller scale, we already talked about this, so let's kind of skip on. Larger scale, we've already talked about some of these. And decision making, I think let's skip this for the sake of time. So labor hierarchies, this is another thing that I wanted to point out. This is a graph from Seth Holmes' book, Fresh Fruit, Broken Bodies, which is an ethnography of migrant indigenous Oaxacan Triqui farm workers from Oaxaca up to the Saja Valley in Washington. And one thing that he lays out in that book is this racial hierarchy of who does what on the farm, and what this would look like exactly for each case, each farmer, each community will be different. But in general, we see many of these trends about, the hierarchy of work that is being done from sort of the most to the least respected, safe, etc., being very racialized and stratified, and along racial lines, along citizenship lines, language lines, etc. I highly recommend that book if you are interested. Okay, and then I also wanted to just point ahead to the future and some of the policy debates happening now. So the next Farm Bill, which is our big national USDA budget and sort of outlines policies at the national level for food and for agriculture, but mostly food. The next Farm Bill is due to be written next year in 2018. And you can go on to the next one. This is sort of what is in the Farm Bill, which is mostly nutrition. So one thing that isn't in the Farm Bill is labor. And there has been some talk for a number of years about having a labor title. Right now there are 12 titles in the Farm Bill that cover everything from commodities to conservation. But there's not a labor title, and there's very, very little in the Farm Bill about labor. So some people have been saying we should have a labor title that specifically addresses these issues. That is politically unlikely. However, and there are some ways that we could possibly tie labor into the Farm Bill in kind of sneaky ways. So something that people are talking about with both labor, conservation, and beginning farmer programs, which of course we expect conservation and beginning farmer programs that do exist to be cut, is to tie some of those into the commodity and crop insurance programs, so that, for example, a farmer could only get a crop insurance payment if they met some minimum labor standards or some minimum environmental standards, and maybe, for example, beginning farmers should have a slightly higher rate of compensation in the crop insurance program or something like that. So I just wanted to kind of throw that out there as an added layer, and then we can just skip ahead to the last slide. And these are just some of the specific programs. Actually, one back. Yeah, okay. So
I think that in general, based on what Margiana was saying, it seems like maybe an idea to launch us into a workshop is thinking about how policy doesn't always reflect practice, and they don't always go hand in hand. So whether it's talking about who is doing what farming and that labor hierarchy that Margiana put up there, or if it's about laws on overtime, where agricultural laborers are exempt from being paid overtime, except with many farms, they're so multifaceted that laborers and workers end up packing vegetables for market or driving trucks. And I think that there are many instances, some of which we just mentioned, where the practices of actual farmers don't line up with what the policies are. So we're interested in breaking up into a few groups, brainstorming from the point of view of specific typologies of beginning farmers, and thinking about what sort of policies could be put in place, either in the Farm Bill or otherwise, that would benefit young farmers and help kind of break down some of these barriers that we talked about to entering the industry of farming.
So as we go into this workshop section, think about policies on sort of these different planes or different scales. So from farm level policies that like an individual farmer could have, to regional, to local policies, to regional policies, to national policies. So any of those, and do you want to talk a little bit about the groups?
So we thought that one group would be thinking from the point of view of urban farmers.
You'll go with Nathaniel.
and that maybe will be this section of the room. And then peri-urban, often well-educated farmers. That would be people similar to myself working on Sienna farms. I'm maybe in an apprenticeship program and an internship program. And we can be kind of the middle of the room here. And then the last section would be rural returning family farmers. And that will be with Margiana, this third of the room. We'll talk for maybe 10 minutes and then come back together and discuss some of the thoughts that we all have.
And have a Q&A, so you can think about your questions also. Okay, so urban farmers, peri-urban farmers, and more larger scale rural farmers.
And maybe we can all circle together in the center of these sections.